So I guess we are good to go. Start with a word of prayer. Our Father, we thank you for the day. We thank you for celebrating communion with us. Pray that we would be worthy soldiers in your army. Pray that this morning's lesson would be a part of building your kingdom. Pray in Christ's name, amen. So, last week we were talking about incentives. Just want to do a quick review on the incentives and where we've been so far. We're going to talk today about the tithe because it came up last week and it's too big of a discussion to have included in there. So I broke it out and some of this will be the economics portion of incentives on tithing. But others, an additional part of this is going to be about the tithe itself and maybe more of a bunny trail, but we're going to talk about tithing because it's a topic of some interest. A quick review on where we've been. All human action is economic. It is an attempt, all the action that we take is an economic transaction. We are attempting to exchange a less satisfactory state of affairs for a more satisfactory state of affairs. And our actions demonstrate our values. Our actions actually impute values to the object of our actions. So if we bend over to pick up a penny, we are imputing value to that penny. If we spend time doing homework, if we spend time studying the Bible, we are imputing value, our value, to that work. These things don't have value. A penny doesn't have value in and of itself beyond the action that we'll take to obtain it. At regeneration, God changes what our values are. He changes that internal scale, that internal menu of choices that we employ, and instead of being fleshly in our bent, fleshly in our desires, we become godly in our desires. Not perfectly, and our actions don't perfectly reflect everything that God would have us do, but by God's changing of our values, we will think more godly. We will act more godly, and that's what's happening at regeneration. Regeneration is an economic transaction because it affects what we do. Incentives are intended to affect our values as well, and so we talked about incentives that are man-made. We talked about incentives that are in the Bible, and we went through a bunch of examples of those last week as well. There's incentive tied to tithing, which is why we're getting into this today. Men provide incentives for others to act. Advertising, marketing is incentivizing us. It is intending to affect the value that we place on things. And of course, biblical laws, even man-made laws, are incentives to change our behavior, to either not act in a certain way or and this is where our civil governments really get into big problems, is when they incentivize us to act a certain way rather than simply putting out the law saying, if you transgress this law, we will act as God's agents of vengeance and do the punishment. It's when they try to get us to do what they consider the proper things that they stray grossly. But even God's laws are incentives for us to act in a certain way. His laws that say, don't do this, because He will punish us eternally for that kind of behavior. So laws are incentives. So laws are economic in their nature. The Bible, of course, has many incentives, laws, promises, curses, blessings, and we talked about that today. So what about the tithe? We talked about this just briefly. We touched on it last week. What about the tithe? Does it carry an incentive? And does the tithe carry over into the New Testament? And I think yes and yes. And so we'll talk about these things. Nobody questions Old Testament tithing. People today question New Testament tithing in the New Testament era. But what about Old Testament Nobody questions that. We tithe to the Levites. Israel tithed to the Levites. And the passages were very clear about the reasons. Levites were guardians of the sacraments in the temple. Priests were Levites, and they had no inheritance in the land. They were provided for through the tithe. So as God's representatives to the people, they acted as agents performing the sacrifices, and to not pay it was to steal. So you were violating one of the Big Ten by not paying your tithe, although there were no mandatory tithes. I mean, yes, it's mandatory, it was commanded, but there was no civil enforcement of that. There was no governmental enforcement of the tithe. The tithe is a system of recognizing God's sovereignty. We need to recognize that everything is God's. Not just the 10%, even the other 90% that we get to keep. It's all God's. But by tithing, we're recognizing through the first fruits, through the tithing, that He has given us this. And we are recognizing His sovereignty over us. The people tithed to the Levites. The Levites tithed to the priests. The family of Aaron were the priests, and they got a tenth of the tenth. And the priests tithed to nobody, because on earth there was no higher authority. They represented God, and so as the highest representative of God, there was no one to tithe to. So by acting in God's stead, they were receiving the tithe, but didn't tithe on that. I like to think of us as sharecroppers. We are given talents, land, time, all the resources that God gives us. And if you understand the system of sharecropping, you actually farm somebody else's land in order to keep part of the crops. But you owe the owner of the land his piece. And so that's kind of what we are. God owns it all. He's given us this. We are able to make increase, and we remit some to God. He gives us all these opportunities. And if we don't tithe, if we don't recognize God's sovereignty by giving back, we are fighting against a very prominent passage of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 8:18 says that God gives us the power to make wealth. Here's what it says. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth. Power to make wealth is the power to have an increase, to develop an increase, that He may confirm His covenant, which He swore to your fathers as it is this day. We often talk about God gives us the power to make wealth. We don't often focus on this idea that it's to confirm His covenant. That's an important point, because in there is an incentive. If we are to take dominion, if we are to develop Christ's kingdom here on earth, then we need that power to make wealth. He's giving us the power to make wealth so that we can indeed build the kingdom. You can't build a kingdom without resources. He's giving us the power to make wealth to build the kingdom. And what we're doing with the wealth is an economic activity. So here's an incentive, and it's an economic incentive as well. Now before Moses and Aaron and then Levites and Levitical tithing and all of those kinds of things, Abram paid a tithe to Melchizedek. You remember a story in Genesis, was it 14? I think, yes, Genesis 14, where the 5 kings fought the 4 kings. The 4 kings came down from the north. They took Abram. They kicked the king of Sodom around a bit, and they took Abram and his family and all the people. And Lot raised an army, went and recovered it all. And as he's coming back, he's coming through Salem, Melchizedek comes out with wine and bread, and essentially gives a communion. And Abram tithed of all he had, all his goods, to Melchizedek. So there was a tithe in place prior to the commandment for tithe. Now, we can kind of deduce, as the Westminster Confession talks about good and reasonable deductions, we have to deduce that this was known. We see tithing before there was a command to tithe. So we have to deduce that God had commanded this elsewhere. But there was a tithe to Melchizedek, so there was tithing before the Levites. And in Hebrews, it makes a big deal out of how even the Levites ended up tithing because they tithed while in Abram's loins. So, Hebrews. So we see a tithe. Does that carry over? Is what we're examining. In his own household, Abram wasn't required to tithe because he was the priest. Before there was a priestly system set up, Abram, as the head of his household, acted as the priest, acted as the mediator between God and his family. He was the covenant head. He was the federal head. We talked about that this morning as well. I couldn't have planned some of these interactions any better. But in Salem, he was under the priestly authority of Melchizedek and required to acknowledge that as high priest, Melchizedek represented those under his authority. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, king of Jerusalem, the king of peace, prince of peace. An interesting theophany, we think. And Abram tithed to Melchizedek. He tithed to God through the priest Melchizedek. It's interesting to note, too, that in the Old Testament, wherever revival or reformation took place, tithing was restored, and it was talked about. There are two examples I'll give here. When Hezekiah restored the Passover, which, like the tithe, had been neglected for years, the tithe was also restored. We see that in 2 Chronicles 31:6. The sons of Israel and Judah who lived in the cities of Judah also brought in the tithe of oxen and sheep. This was when they were coming in for the Passover. They also brought in the tithe of oxen and sheep and the tithe of sacred gifts, which were consecrated to the Lord their God, and placed them in heaps. So the tithe it amounts to a lot. It does amount to an awful lot. And in Nehemiah's covenant renewal, the people vowed their tithes. Nehemiah 10:37 said, "We will also bring the first of our dough, our contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, oil to the priests at the chambers of the house of our God, and the tithe of our ground to the Levites. For the Levites are they who receive the tithes in all the rural towns." So, examples of revival. Nehemiah that was a big revival. That was a big reformation that was taking place in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And as the people renewed their covenant, as they renewed their vows to the Lord, they were convicted about the tithes, and they brought them in. It's not like Nehemiah's commanding this. The people brought them in. Failure to pay the tithe was frowned upon by God. In Malachi 3:9, "You're cursed with a curse, for you're robbing me, the whole nation, of you." Maybe frowned upon as too weak. Cursing with a curse by God is a pretty strong incentive, is it not? Economic incentive to bring in the tithe. If you remember, people, how are we robbing you? Well, you're robbing you by not bringing in your tithes. At the same time, there was a promise, not just the stick, but there was the carrot. Both, if you remember last week when we were talking about incentives, disincentives are the same as an incentive. A punishment will give you the same effect as the reward, because it brings about the behavior that's being intended. In Malachi 3:10, here's a big promise: "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so there may be food in my house, and test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows." A huge promise, and a very interesting test that God encourages us to put him to. A.W. Pink makes much of this idea of a test. It says he He references Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Says Pink. Now that same expression is used in Genesis 7 in connection with the deluge, is used in Malachi 3. It's the same words. So you're talking about an overwhelming opening up of the windows of heaven in the deluge, are we not? For the flood. And Pink is saying it's the same phrase that's used in Malachi for the blessings that God will pour out on his people who tithe. And Pink also goes on to say it doesn't mean an abundant spiritual blessing. It's a temporal one. And so it's an interesting look at an incentive that's placed along with the tithe. Also, in the tithing, people were encouraged to bring their things to the Levites, who would put it in a storehouse. It was a single storehouse, belongs to God. He calls it his house. Clearly, the storehouse was the house of God, the temple, and Malachi's prophecy was referring to the tithe to the priests. It sounds like a command, but it has incentives attached. A tithe to the priesthood is what's in view, though, when we're tithing. A tithe to the priesthood, and we're going to talk about what that means as we get into this a little bit further. Another point, Matthew 23:23. This is a phrase that we're all familiar with. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. People say, no, in the New Testament, the tithe is done away with. That doesn't sound to me like Christ is doing away with the tithe here. It sounds like without neglecting the tithe, we should do the weightier matters of the law. And so Christ is, to me, is clearly ratifying a tithe here in the New Testament. There's a parallel passage in Luke on that. Seems pretty clear Christ is still requiring it. Now, a lot of commentators, and you'll read this a lot of commentators insist that this idea pertains only to Old Covenant Israel. Christ was talking to the Old Covenant people, right? But if we can easily escape that command, can we not say that everything he taught that we have in the Gospels? Yes? As far as the so you no longer have leprosy, show yourself to the priest. But you see, those laws were still in place, and those laws we can show were abrogated with Christ. If the laws were tied to protecting the seed of Christ, the seed lines, all those kinds of things, land laws, seed laws, purification, ritual separation, all of those kinds of things. No cotton with wool or linen, that kind of thing. No mixed seed. All of those things pointed toward protecting the seed line of Christ, to protect the promises that God had made, that Christ was going to come through the line of Judah, and that also to symbolize that Israel was to be set apart from all the other nations. Those things ended up going away with Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. The purification law there was a separation law. And so that went away because now the Holy Spirit's been poured out. Now all men are called to be in covenant. So at that point, when Christ said that, he hadn't yet fulfilled everything. It hadn't all been done, and that system hadn't gone away. That Levitical priesthood had not gone away. So it was still legitimate for him to do that. Is that okay?
I guess that's then the challenge to tithing then now, because there's no Levites anymore. So the people that say, hey, tithing is going by the wards.
Yes, but that wasn't a ritual separation type of a law. That is recognizing God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty hasn't gone away because of Christ's work on the cross. So the Levites didn't have an inheritance in the land, and the cultural and religious aspects of the work that they did was worthy of support and needed to be supported. So there's that aspect, and then there's the aspect of recognizing God's sovereignty. So those are the kinds of things that do go through. The Ten Commandments come through. They're moral laws. There's a moral aspect to our recognizing God's sovereignty and our position in this whole hierarchy. So the tithe is a part of that, as opposed to one of the ritual laws that did go away. Okay. So there was no question that the tithe wasn't one of the weightier provisions of the law, but according to Christ, the tithe was not to be neglected. And, as a matter of fact, now in the New Testament, we've been called to give much more. I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God. It's your spiritual service of worship. It's an acceptable offering, is to offer our entire lives to Christ. But the tithes still symbolize our subordination. We're more accountable than Old Testament Christians because to whom much is given, much is required. And we've been given much more than the Old Testament believers ever had. We have the whole Scripture, and we know what's been done for us. We have the Holy Spirit poured out in this world, working towards the end of building up the kingdom. So we live in extraordinary abundance, and knowing that it's more blessed to give than receive, we should be generous, and at a minimum, we should be tithing. He's explicit, God's explicit in his promised incentives and disincentives to the Israelites for obedience and disobedience. I think that carries through to us. So those are the things that I took out of last week's talk on incentives, because it was going to lead into many more questions about tithing. Now, I entitled this Economic Quandaries, Tithing. So what are the quandaries about tithing? And that ultimately they come down to these two matters. It's how much do we tithe, and to whom do we tithe? These are, and I'm not going to pretend to have an answer for each and every one of you. I think that it's a quandary because these are things that we have to work through. I think every individual needs to come to a determination. I have ideas about this, and I follow my ideas, but I'm going to raise some of these questions, and hopefully we're going to get into some discussion. Arguments about how much end up being divided into two sub-arguments: what percentage and on how much. First, about the percentages. Now, God is very gracious. He tells us what a tithe is. It's 10%. All right? So we don't need to worry, are we giving enough? But there are two camps here. One believes that there are three separate tithes. One's called the Levitical tithe, sometimes called the social tithe. You'll see it in a lot of writings. One is the rejoicing tithe, and one is the poor tithe. Everybody knows about the Levitical tithe / social tithe. It's that 10% annual that was given to the Levites. That was for the support of the church and all the cultural functions that they did. So we're not going to go into that one. What you may not be familiar with, though, are the rejoicing tithe and the poor tithe. The rejoicing tithe was considered to be a second annual tithe, 10%, for partying, of all things. All right? Sounds all right. In Jerusalem, if possible, at the Feast of Booths, or elsewhere if it was too far to get to Jerusalem. What this verse goes on to say is that you can convert your tithe, which the tithes were, of course, on crops. You can convert that to money and then just spend the money in locally. You may spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink or whatever your heart desires. And therefore you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. An interesting idea that we need to, as Christians, as believers, we need to be living in a rejoicing mode. We need to be joyful in our lives. Not like the Ephesians. We'll study this when we get to chapter 2. And, the Ephesians, Christ was saying, you've lost your first love. Yes, I commend all the works you're doing, but you've lost your first love. You're gritting your teeth as you do Christian work. Yeah, we're going to do it because we've got to do it, and we do it. But they weren't happy in it. They weren't joyful in it. This rejoicing tithe was pointing to something along those lines, that we need to live in rejoicing and thanksgiving. And notice here too, I'm not showing it in this verse, but the Levites and the poor were absolutely prominent in this rejoicing. They were to be invited, they were to be hosted and feted at these feasts. So the rejoicing tithe was a second 10%. It was to be shared with the Levite and the local poor. You shall not neglect the Levite who is in your town. He has no portion or inheritance among you. Then there's the poor tithe. Now the poor tithe happened every third year. It's a tenth every third year. Deuteronomy 14, 28 and 29, following right on the heels of the rejoicing tithe. You have a question?
Was the rejoicing tithe every year?
Yes.
Wasn't it every 7? No?
I don't think so.
Thought it was. I might be wrong.
Pretty sure it was an every year. I think it was an every year thing. But I will double check that. Yeah. No, in the 7th year, the sabbatical year, there was no tithe because there was no increase.
14:22, thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God.
Year by year.
So I think that's the passage you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That would be year by year.
Yeah, that is right there. Yep. Yep. Joel? Oh, okay. So now the poor tithe, which was every third year, was also another 10%. At the end of every third year, you should bring out all tithe of your produce in that year, deposit it in your town. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien, the orphan, the widow in your town, i.e. the poor, shall come and eat and be satisfied in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So here we have another third, if you're doing it every third year, a third of your income. So you could make out that there's going to be about a 20% quote tax, if you want to call it a tax, because there's no tithe in the 7th year. You've got the 10%, and the third that happens over the course of 6 years, and you even that out over 7. It comes out to about 20%. Still way less than what we pay in taxes to our civil governments, right? We'd be happy with 23% tax bill. The other camp, however, believes that this was all inclusive, that there was one single tithe, and that all of these things were talking about the one tithe. Their reasoning is that Abram and Jacob paid only one tithe, not multiple tithes. And so would God increase the tithe over time? They say no. It's also clear from Scripture that the Melchizedekal priesthood is superior to the Levitical How can the Levites claim more than Melchizedek could claim? An interesting point. If it's superior, the inferior would not get more. So those are reasonable arguments. In addition, they claim that the Levitical tithe is on seed, fruit, and animals, whereas the rejoicing tithe is on grain, new wine, and oil. 10% on different things. You know, I don't know how you separate seed and grain. Nonetheless, those are their arguments for saying this all kind of there's one tithe that's encompassed. So it's a quandary. What do you think? Are there one tithe? Is there one tithe, or are there three tithes? Things to wrestle with, to come to terms with. You might come to terms with it by saying, okay, the gifts and offerings, your tithe, and then offerings are above your tithe. Maybe that above the tithe of 10% is still tithing, but maybe you're handling it by doing more sacrificial giving above the 10% gift. It's an interesting quandary. It's something that we have to come to grips with. Now, on what do we tithe? On our increase, yes, but gross or net. You know, most of us are not farmers bringing in the sheaves. We're not counting sheaves out. We're counting out money. On our paychecks, we have two different numbers. There's the top line, there's the bottom line, and they're distinctly different. Arguments for the gross. We should pay God before we pay the state. Argument against the gross. What if the state taxes us 90%? We're left without anything, as if we give 10% on the gross. That's a morally impossible situation. Doesn't seem likely, but you know, that's where we are. Arguments for the net. God's law does not require paying a tithe on someone else's income. Government's income. If you never control it, it's not yours. We're not taxed on what the locusts eat. The farmers didn't bring in what they should have harvested as a tithe. They brought in 1/10 of what they harvested. Argument against the net. We can't give anyone priority over God, which is the argument for the gross. There's a quandary. What do you think? Now, there are some nuances in this. Go ahead, Sid.
Is Scripture fairly consistent in speaking of tithing on the increase?
It is.
So increase would imply net. Is that?
It does. It does. Okay. And yet, we have this dilemma where we have, by our own neglect, allowed civil governments to run roughshod over us by not insisting on God's law. And so, should our sin negate the responsibility we have to tithe on what we've earned, so to speak? That tends to be the argument, you know, that the wages of sin are expensive. It costs, and we're going to have to take our beatings. There are some nuances to these things. There are those, for instance, North argues that if you can report your income to the civil government and get a deduction for your tithe, well then you should net that out and pay on what you're... So, see, you're not allowed to deduct anything for the Social Security taxes, so that would be part of what the locusts eat. But if you're getting back because of your tithe, then it's not just your net. It's a little bit more than that, because you gotta add back in that part that you're getting back from the government because you've tithed, and that's a charitable deduction that you're... So, I mean, there are formulas for this. Believe me, in Christian circles, you can go on the internet, you can find about 5 different formulas for how to calculate what you should tithe on. But mostly it comes to gross or net. And so It's something that we have to decide about. We have to think about. Yes?
And there's a lot.
A lot of other things, if you really want to get technical in the details, to consider. Like your increase, if your value of your investment has gone up, but you haven't sold it, is that an increase?
Not yet. You haven't harvested it.
Right?
It's
So-
like saying that the crops are out there in the field. I'm gonna bring them in early, or I'm gonna pay the tithe on them, and then the locusts eat it. You don't have the increase. It's almost presumptuous. You're presuming on the increase. Yes.
So how does that fit with retained earnings?
Retained earnings?
Yeah, like like say my dad's in a partnership. So,
Yes. Retained earnings.
He's taxed on all the earnings of the company, whether or not they're distributed or not.
Right.
So how do you look at that from a tithe point of view?
I would look at that from the standpoint of, have I harvested that? You've kept it. You've decided, there's no difference ultimately between retained earnings and a bank account. If he had taken it out and put it in the bank, as opposed to not taking it out and leaving it in his bank. So it would be the kind of thing that you have to tithe on your increase. I would say yes. If you haven't taken it out, but you earned it, you have had an increase, and you have actually harvested it. You simply haven't paid it out of this pocket into this pocket. What we're doing is we're making distinctions between the pocket I'm going to pay God out of, as opposed to, okay, it's in my pants.
But if the other guys vote to never pull that profit out, you're going to be paying tax on money you've never seen and potentially might not see if they use it as a capital expenditure, and soon you're going to be paying 30%.
But if you've earned it, if you've earned it and you've got an increase.
He has no control over it yet. But the other voting party doesn't know about this person. He doesn't have it.
But it's his.
He can't use it. Until it's claimed.
And-
So it seems like it's still in the field to me.
And these are the quandaries that,
Yeah.
these are the quandaries that we wrestle with.
If you take that same principle, if you're going to say in a partnership where he can't just take the money,
Yes.
that it's still his earnings, then you almost have to take the same principle and say Social Security is, you still have to pay tithe on it, because even though you never could get it, you still earned it. Like, isn't it the same principle you have to?
There's a sense in which you're right there. Yeah, absolutely.
And what about other stock companies? Apple made a bunch of profit. They didn't disperse it as dividends. Now am I supposed to be paying tax on my Apple stock that went up? Or that they made profit that they're not giving out? They're sitting on billions in cash. I mean, you get really...
Yeah, you're right.
Unless it's actually given to you, if you can't control it. If you're a
Which is-
100% partner, yeah, but if you can't control it and they decide not to give it, it seems like you really haven't really earned it yet,
Right.
in my mind.
It's right here. If you never control it, it's not yours.
Right, and I would see that as a
Yeah,
minority
perhaps.
partnership.
If you don't control it, it's not yours.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's how I would interpret it.
Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, you can get technical all day long. It ends up being a question of, there's no mandate. I mean, there's no government coming around here putting a gun to your head saying you didn't pay your tithe. There's an interesting aspect to this. There are churches who follow closely the tithe that's being paid, and there are churches who will discipline their members by not giving communion or not giving voting rights if they're not tithing. But that's not us. And I'm just saying that there are people who will take this out to the nth degree, and they're going to calculate and calculate and calculate. If we're doing that kind of calculation, I think maybe we're a little bit too concerned with our money. Maybe. It's just a thought. Are we testing God by giving, or aren't we?
When you get into that complicated of a calculation, does it lend toward, or maybe indicate, giving begrudgingly?
Maybe. Are we giving joyfully, or are we not?
when you're trying to.
We're trying to figure out how to not give.
Weasel out of.
It's not. We're not weaseling so much
Yeah,
as just being concerned about, are we giving on our increase? You know, you want to be sure to give on your increase, but how much and what's it on? Understood. I mean, that's why it's a quandary.
Probably would have to do with the attitude that you have when you're trying to figure that out.
That's right. Yeah, and requires some self-examination. It does. It does.
Try to get through this quickly. To whom do we pay the tithe? And of course we say to the Lord, but represented by whom? Is it the church or Christian ministries? It's a huge debate in Christianity, evangelical Christianity. Rushdoony and North, his son-in-law, really differed on this immensely. Who do we give to? And you quickly run into an issue of, what is the church? It's an issue of ecclesiology. Well, who is the church? Excerpts from an impassioned defense of tithing. This was written, there was a guy named Rich Lusk, who is a member at Messiah's congregation where Joel visited there this weekend, Steve Schlüssel's church. This guy named Rich Lusk wrote an article for Tim Keller's church. Their elders wanted an article about tithing, and he came up with 8 different theses on tithing. And I would recommend it. It's just look up Rich Lusk and tithing, and you'll get to this article. But he's passionate about the tithe goes to the church and not the ministries. Here's some of his arguments. The Bible doesn't contemplate Christian groups other than the church. Nowhere in the New Testament do you see anything but the church talked about. Levites were typologically church officers. He's saying if you take the Old Testament Levites and priests, those are your church officers. And it's to them that the tithe is owed, that the church has a divine right to this, because the Levites are dispensers of the sacraments. They guard the temple. They guard the sacraments. You don't go down to the corner grocery store to get your baptism and your communion. Neither do you go to Campus Crusade for baptism or sacraments, the communion. So that it goes to, his argument is it goes to the Levites. New Testament evidence points to the tithes collected in the church, which indeed it does. Paul's letters when he was collecting monies, he was always in a church. Also, says Lusk, it's up to the New Covenant Levites, the church's elders, not the tithers themselves, to decide how the tithe money is to be allocated. Okay, so here we start to get into some really interesting things, that the tithing is not discretionary by the tithers. Paying the tithe is a way we subordinate ourselves to the institutional church and acknowledge Christ's lordship over all he has given over us. So Lusk is setting up a hierarchy of Christ, the church, and the church members, not Christ and his body. And says Lusk, we do not have the right to discipline the church by withholding the tithe. How do you discipline your church? You're allowed to leave, but you're not allowed to stop tithing? If you're not allowed to stop tithing, then are you allowed to leave? I don't know. These are very interesting ideas about church membership and ecclesiology. And
so if you were to stop tithing to discipline your church, would you be responsible to do something else with that money for the Lord?
Those are the arguments of the other side. The people who say that it is
tithing to Christian ministry, who would say that it's discretionary on part of the tither, and that the tither has the responsibility to make sure that his tithes are being properly allocated. Yes? Sid's squirming.
I'm thinking about how we often treat taxes. No one really will entertain the idea that it's up to the taxpayer
Yes.
to decide how much we pay in taxes. When you talk about broad scheme,
Right.
outside of IRBC perhaps.
Yes.
But nobody wants to say, well, we shouldn't be paying these taxes because we don't control how our corrupt civil governments
Yeah.
use that money. I mean, even in here, we all say, well, we don't want our tax money going to pay for abortions.
Right.
And yet we still pay the tax.
We do.
Because we have a gun pointed at our head.
We have a gun pointed at our heads.
Church doesn't have that kind of teeth.
It doesn't. That's correct. Would we, if we didn't have the gun pointed at our heads, would we pay those taxes for abortions or for?
You know,
Who would?
Perhaps. Perhaps.
There are a few who wouldn't as well.
I know
Even here, I think.
I know a couple. Joel.
Okay, here, Acts 19, this idea that the only Christian group, if you will, is the church. Okay, I thought of this from Acts 19. He went into the synagogue and spoke boldly for 3 months, reasoning and persuading and entertaining the things of the kingdom of God. But when some were hardened and did not believe, and spoke evil of the way before the multitude, he departed from them. Sounds like he's going out of the synagogue.
Out of the synagogue.
And, or church, as we would sort of figure it here, kind of, right?
Well, the synagogue would have been the Jews. He was trying to persuade, he was trying to convert the Jews.
Right. But if it's a godly synagogue, it would be a church.
Yeah, okay, correct.
Okay? And so he leaves that, and yeah, okay, fair enough, because it's obviously an ungodly synagogue, because they're kicking Paul out. Okay? He departed from them and withdrew the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. And this continued for 2 years, so that all who dwelled in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. It sounds like, to me, the school of Tyrannus is what we would call a parachurch organization that was doing a lot of good, and you'd be doing a whole lot better by giving your money to the school of Tyrannus than that particular local sign.
I would argue that. It doesn't, however, there's no model there that says that people donated to or tithe
Right,
to.
it doesn't say that,
Right.
that's true. But through that parachurch organization, it sounds like the Word of God.
Went out.
Yeah.
Right, but then neither were they dispensing sacraments.
Yeah, that we know of.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sure doesn't say the word.
Right. So.
I'll try to get through this quick. Parachurch separates primary functions of the church from one another, and thus distorts one's view of the church. The word, sacraments, discipline, the three marks of a true church, all belong together, but a parachurch divorces them. That's his view. Only a strong institutional church can cause Christian culture to flourish. I think only strong Christianity can cause a culture to flourish, but I'm not sure about the institutional church. It's in it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I'm going to argue with them. Wow. Only a strong institutional church can cause Christian culture. Roman Catholicism was strong.
Strong institutional church.
Strong institutional church and the culture going out. I really would argue.
So,
It's interesting. It's interesting that this tithing discussion ends up in a discussion about ecclesiology, is it not? But you have to get there when you're going into to whom do we pay the tithe. The proponents of this view include Gary North and James Jordan. Rushdoony taking a different view, saying the tithe should be given to the church considered as an organism. The church, this is the capital C church, as considered as an organism, the body of believers, not as an organization, an institution with officers and membership. So Rushdoony takes the opposite view, that you should be discretionary in your tithing. He argued that the Levites performed cultural services, including sacrifices, education, music, judging, and the like. They tithed to the priests, and the priests are what's now represented by the church. So Rushdoony and Martin Selbrede argue that the church is owed a tenth of the tenth, and that the other 9% needs to be spent on other godly kingdom building efforts, which could include potentially a Christian school. Now, this is not an argument to say run out and enroll your kids in a private school unless it's godly, and use that. I mean, we have tithers in this congregation, and we're very appreciative of that. But we would understand if somebody took this view. That's obviously, because we don't do the membership thing here, we're on the side, or the opposite side of Lusk, who I believe is well-intentioned, but he's in a sense, he's talking his own book. You know, he's an elder in a church that needs support, and he's saying that people should be tithing there. Yes, I believe that pastors are worthy of support, and there are things that the church needs to do. But I also understand the other viewpoint. Interesting to note that the proponents of the view that it's discretionary, that tithing is discretionary, also are generally believe that there are 3 different tithes that add up to the 20%, and the others tend to believe that there's only one tithe. So North might be a notable exception there. I think that North believes in the three different tithes, although he's very strongly the church has a divine right to the tithe. So there's that quandary explained. So this was not a comprehensive study of the tithe. It's introducing you to the topic of the tithe. More could be said of Christ as a high priest, as Melchizedek, the church as a nation of priests. Okay, the hierarchical structure of the church, is it God, church, and members, or is it God and the church? There's a whole other argument about giving in secret. You know, don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. Bo Marinoff has a very lengthy article about this. And that's my last slide. Additional reading, Tithing by Pink, Tithing and Dominion by Powell and Rushdoony gives you one view. Tithing in the Church by North gives another view. And then there's Marinoff's article, The Top 7 Reasons Why Christians Should Give Anonymously. All you have to do is Google that on the internet. So there we have opened the worm can, the can of worms, as it were, on tithing.
So,
do you have time to quickly say your position, or would you rather that not be out there?
We tithe on gross, I believe. Beth put some money in the envelope. I don't even look at that. I don't even know.
But then, I don't know, maybe a few years ago,
Gross became gross.
it's become much more net than gross.
Okay.
If you need me to change that, you need to let me know.
But we give otherwise.
Yes.
And see, that's
Yeah.
it. So we
tithe to the church.
tithe net to the
Church, but we have other ministries that we support as well. So I mean, it's.
your position
But
is
as far
to the local
Church. That's what you would argue for.
I would argue that it's best to tithe. I think that discretionary is fine. That's my view. I don't have really strong feelings that it needs to come here to the church. I don't. I believe, just as we've discussed about membership, we believe that we are binding someone's conscience if we were to ask them to sign a church covenant membership agreement, sign on to say, we're members here and we're going to obey the elders, or else. Because that's what membership ends up being.
And I've seen that become meaningless, and it is essentially meaningless in Christian churches today. People hop from church to church to church, regardless of excommunication, even. Well, we've seen that in the BFC. The church that we left at Trinity excommunicated a couple who went to another BFC church and were welcomed into membership. within the same denomination. They didn't even recognize one church's excommunication. So, what does membership mean? It means what they want it to mean. It means that if you want to have control over your members, the elders have a means of putting control over their members. And in the same way, I would not want to bind someone's conscience to say, you know what? I'm going to count Ryan's money. I wonder how much he's really making. Is he really tithing? No, it shouldn't be that way. I really don't think so. So that's our view on this. If we struggle, we struggle. If we prosper, we prosper. As you know, we go through the finances in January, February, and this church has prospered. And it's the people here are generous. And some I know who's giving, and some I don't know who's giving, because there's a fair amount of cash that just comes into the box that we don't know where it comes from. We use that in benevolent. We use some to pay Joel. We use it benevolently. Elena Regetz has testified that we have helped her and in her situation with Clark's being out of the house, and finances are from time to time they're difficult for her, and we've had to help out. I trust that we use them wisely, and we're trying to use them for the furtherance of the kingdom and for the building up of the saints, and the saints that we have in our sphere of influence are what we can do. We've helped some other ministries. We've helped Paul Raymond's ministry from time to time. Other things. Yes.
Dan, you haven't spoken yet. Your turn.
I was just curious if you think Gary North would say, no, we should not give directly to Elena, but we should give to the church. He trusts that the church would give to her.
That's what he would say.
He would say that.
That's exactly what he would say. Yes.
You can give to her, just not part of the 10.
Right. Well, I'm talking about the 10.
Yeah.
But that's something you really impressed upon me is we have to know who we're giving to. That we don't read an article about a ministry and send them money. We have to know who's leading that. We have to know. We have to be sure.
We must be responsible.
Yeah.
With the gifts that God has given us.
Because there's so much out there that looks so good that is not.
That's not.
And we don't know it until we investigate that.
This leads into a little bit of a bunny trail on the poor tithe. There are those like North who believe
that the poor tithe is something that you should be including in your tithing. But then at the same time, there are those who say, well, the poor tithe needs to be given to the poor directly. It's a face-to-face transaction. You need to determine whether that person is in need and is a Christian or is not going to use it for evil purposes. That it's a face-to-face thing, and that by doing that, you're helping that person up.
Examples or clear cut. This is what is to be tagged or tithed. This is where it's supposed to come from. This is where it's supposed to go, and this is what it's supposed to be used for. Do we have a clear cut what it's supposed to be used for in the New Testament, and how can we identify if our leadership is misusing it?
I'll do a second one first. Is that you hold us accountable. You ask us when we talk about the financing in January, February, whenever that is, or even during the year. You come and you talk to us and ask us.
Yeah. But how would I identify objectively that it should not be used for this?
What's the biblical standard?
Yeah.
Is it? I think what we have to do is look and see if what we're spending it on is
godly, if it's kingdom building, if it is a worthy cause. You can certainly take issue with the things that we spend money on.
Sure. No, I know, but then
yeah.
Come down to, well,
I see this as biblical, and here I can back it up.
When I said that the New Testament Christian has more responsibility than the Old, we have been given a great deal of freedom, and but with that freedom comes an enormous responsibility to look into things. to understand things, to hold all these things against Scripture. The freedoms that we have as New Testament Christians just require much, much more of us. We have to be more diligent, and we have to think about these things a lot more. And the first part of your question was, what things in the New Testament, what things, and again, I'll go right back to the answer I just gave, or the thing we were just talking about. We have great responsibilities, and we need to, there's no shortage of call on the funds, but we need to be diligent to look and see, are they worthy? And it's not that we'll ever be mistake-free. We won't.
Jim, sorry.
Just a quick comment. It's not enough for our government to tax us to death, but now on top of it, if you receive a regular paycheck, they put themselves in God's place blasphemously by withholding.
Oh, by withholding.
So they say, well, it's not enough for you to pay us this money, but we're going to take the first fruits that belong to God.
And it's interesting,
Blasphemy is the exact word that you use, that you'll hear in all the books, all the readings about civil government taking it off the top. It's blasphemous because they are putting themselves in God's position. Yeah, no question. All right, we've gone way over, and I'm sorry. We are dismissed.